the idea that there is an intrinsic virtue in doing what my grandfather did as a shipyard worker on the Clyde, in hitting metal for a living instead of doing what I do and tapping at a screen. The idea that the one is more real than the other, it's intuitive and it's therefore popular, but it's wrong. A country that is stuck purely in manufacture is a country that is not getting richer.
Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. I'm Michael Simmons, the Spectator's economics editor. At the weekend, the government recalled Parliament to forcibly take control of British steel. If they hadn't, it would have been the first time since the Industrial Revolution that Britain had lost the ability to make steel from iron and coal. One of just two members of the House of Lords who spoke against that in the debate was Lord Daniel Hannan. And he joins me now with Spectator writer, businessman and journalist Lord Matt Ridley. Daniel, why did you stand out from the crowd?
Well, I wasn't expecting to be one of only two. I thought we had a consensus in this country that nationalisation didn't work very well. It makes you poorer, it subjects industries to political rather than economic decisions, it leads to mismanagement and disinvestment. And certainly that's been true of steel. It was nationalised by Attlee in 1949, and the results were disastrous. It was nationalised again by Wilson in 1967. The results were equally calamitous. Privatisation did at least restore a measure of increase in output. I mean, I thought this was all, obvious. I didn't think we needed to relitigate any of it. And yet, incredibly, we've reached the point as a country where suddenly a consensus has formed around all of these failed policies. The Labour MPs and peers were, if they'd been puppies, they'd have been wagging their tails off in excitement at state ownership. The Lib Dems, as always, were just praising whatever Labour did. Reform wanted to go further and nationalise immediately and more fully. And the Conservatives were ambivalent. And I just, no wonder this country has a growth problem if we've turned our backs on the lessons of the last 50 years.
And Matt, do you agree with that? I mean, isn't steel such an important industry? This would have been, if we do let this plant go and let the furnaces, burn out, then it'll be the first time since the Industrial Revolution that we've not been able to produce naked steel. Isn't that, crucial for us as a country?
Well, we certainly need a lot of steel in this country, and we will recycle quite a lot of it, and that'll come through electric arc furnaces, which we will still have. Yes, it is useful to have virgin steel made at home, but the reason we can't do it profitably here is because we have crazily made it very difficult to be productive enough to be profitable in the steel industry here. And there are two main factors for that. One is the extraordinary bureaucracy, regulation and planning system that we've put around industry, making it very hard to employ people, to invest, to build new plants and so on. And the other, the fundamental one, and the one that's absolutely central, is the cost of energy. We have deliberately driven up the cost of energy in this country so that we are now the most expensive country for electricity and for all other forms of energy in the developed world. And that's for industrial users, but it's also largely true for domestic users. Now, we're not just marginally ahead of other countries. We're 4 times as expensive in terms of electricity as America, 5 times as expensive as China. Energy is the absolutely lifeblood of an industry like steel. I mean, the whole point of it is it's a very energy-intensive industry. And it also depends on a raw material called coal, which we have gigantic quantities of underneath our feet and underneath the North Sea. But we've decided to stop mining and to try and bring it in from Japan, which doesn't have very much coal.
And Daniel, on that point about, this, as Matt, succinctly puts it there, that part of the problem is the sheer, energy costs for running any kind of industry, let alone steel. We seem to be reaching a point with many issues. We look at economic growth as well, where there's this sort of competing voice between the government's commitment to net zero and, until recently, the Conservatives' commitment to net zero versus economic and almost national security necessities. Is something about to change in the arguments made in the public, but also in the government's view on this? And are we finally going to put industry ahead of net zero zealotry?
Well, I don't think people acknowledge that trade-off That's the fundamental problem. We're infantilized. We want to have our cake and eat it. So I was astonished during the debates about renationalisation to find the Greens and the Lib Dems and the people who have been driving what Matt just described, the highest energy costs in the industrialised world, as a matter of industrial policy, right, as a choice, now shedding these crocodile tears about, oh, the steelworkers in Scunthorpe. Actions have consequences. Decisions lead to trade-offs, and our absolute refusal to acknowledge that, our readiness to go along with whatever is the easiest short-term policy, the lowest resistance, the best headline tomorrow, is what's creating all of these problems. Now, for what it's worth, I think we would have a competitive steel industry if we had more realistic energy costs. It wouldn't be huge, right? We still wouldn't supply all of our own domestic needs. I don't see that as a problem. And it's worth stressing this point. Yes, we need steel. Yes, we need to build stuff. We need steel in cars, in aeronautics, in construction, in electronic appliances. And if we want to grow, we definitely need it. But the way to have a secure supply of steel or of anything else is to source it from as wide a variety of producers as possible, so that we are not vulnerable to a localized shock or disruption, which might as easily happen on our own territory as anywhere else. And you know what? That happens to be exactly where we are with steel. You'd think, if you were a casual observer of this debate, that somehow this is about preserving an independent supply so that we don't depend on the Chinese. We don't depend on the Chinese. There's no world in which we depend on the Chinese. Yes, we import a chunk of our steel, but no single country accounts for more than 15% of our imports, not of our total consumption, right? We're still our own biggest supplier, of our imports. And if you then look at who are those countries, are they all China and allied autocracies? Have we become dependent on these countries that are plotting to bring us down? Our biggest source of steel is Germany. Second is Spain. Third is the Netherlands. Fourth is Belgium. You've still got to go through Algeria, Turkey, South Korea, Vietnam before you get to China, which is a nugatory part of our supply. So the whole of this debate is happening on the basis of a falsehood, a widely believed falsehood, but a falsehood nonetheless. And a measure of political maturity and leadership is to spell that out instead of pandering to it.
But would you not accept, even, accepting all of that as being the case, that fundamentally these furnaces are in areas where workers for generations have known nothing else, and even if it's not a security or even economic imperative to have native steel production, that just for a duty to these communities, that the government should step in and keep them going?
Okay, so at least that's an honest argument, right? Let's have that argument made nakedly and politically. We are paying people to keep them in a particular kind of job rather than another kind of job. Now that was more or less the argument that was used in Port Talbot when we agreed to these big subsidies, and it works out as something like £500,000 per job. So or it has in Port Talbot. So for the sake of keeping people in one particular line of work, instead of the transformation that's happening everywhere else, that's the amount of subsidy that we're looking at. Now, is that in the interest? Might it not be preferable to ask some of those men whether they'd rather take the cash, or do you know what, even take a slightly smaller amount of cash and be able to go and set up and do something else, leaving everyone vastly better off? The idea that there is an intrinsic virtue in doing what my grandfather did as a shipyard worker on the Clyde, in hitting metal for a living instead of doing what I do and tapping at a screen. The idea that the one is more real than the other, it's intuitive and it's therefore popular, but it's wrong. A country that is stuck purely in manufacture is a country that is not getting richer. Every country that has moved up the cost of living scale has done so by shifting to services. And that allows us to work shorter hours, live longer, have happier and more fulfilled lives without doing the brutalizing work that my grandfather, maybe not Matt's grandfather, but my grandfather working for someone like Matt's would have done, because that's what we mean by progress. And I wonder how many of those men in Scunthorpe or in Port Talbot really would want their grandchildren to do the same jobs that they're doing.
Well, funnily enough, while we're on grandfathers, I'm sorry to say Daniel is right that whereas his grandfather was toiling away in the shipyards, my grandfather was the second chairman of the Consett Iron Works, which was a post-war nationalised industry set up with a specific new town around it, based around the availability of coal in the northeast coalfield, to produce steel. And it did a great job for a number of decades, but there came a time when it was uneconomic and it wasn't going to work. And Consett is now without steel, without an ironworks, without that kind of manufacturing. But it does have other manufacturing and it does have other service industries. Now, you can argue that the adjustment that Consett had to go through was extremely painful for many people there, and still is for some of them, and that we could have done a much better job of enabling them to make that transition that Daniel mentioned from tough, hot, laborious, dangerous jobs inside a steelworks to whatever they might be doing on keyboards and in the service sector today. We could have done a better job of the transition, but the transition had to happen. We weren't ever going to go on employing 300,000 people in the steel industry in this country, whatever we did. So yes, I think we do have to be realistic about this. We do have to accept that Virgin Steelmaking is going to be a very small employer in national terms, whether we import a lot or not. And in America, more than 50% of steel is now recycled through electric arc furnaces. Steel is one of the most successful industries in reusing the material that it had. Steel does not deteriorate if you remelt it and start again. It's just as good second time round. And there is an awful lot of steel recovered from, everything from dead locomotives to dead buildings available to the industry. So for those who are interested in, as it were, a circular economy with less energy wasted and less stuff dumped, that's a good news story. So there are lots of ways of remaining a steel-using country and to some extent a steel-making country. But in the end, the really important people in work are the people who are buying the steel and installing it in the buildings or the cars or the whatever. Because if we make that expensive, then those goods are expensive, then people don't buy them, or if they buy them, they can't afford other things. It's driving up the productivity of our producers so that we can drive up the living standards of our consumers. That is the real end of economic activity.
Matt, continuing on this point of the jobs, do you believe there's any credibility in this idea of the green transition? Because obviously, someone that's worked at a blast furnace for 10, 20 years is unlikely to become a computer programmer in their next career. And the answer to this from government has always been, well, there'll be similar jobs in wind farms, there'll be similar jobs in solar farms. Do you think that's a credible argument?
Well, I'm afraid to say that the wind and solar industries are even more dependent on China than the steel industry or than the oil industry. That's where these devices are being manufactured, designed and produced. So the number of jobs that have come with that transition is extraordinarily small. And anyway, the whole point is a job making an energy is not what we're after. It's jobs using energy that we want. It's people using the cheapness of electricity to produce AI, to produce steel, in electric arc furnaces and so on. That's the real prize that we should be after. And what we're doing with this so-called green transition is by subsidizing wind and solar, the two unreliables. I don't like calling them renewables because I think the word unreliables is more accurate. Producing those at enormous cost, and the guaranteed price, the contract for difference that is offered to offshore wind turbines in this country is 3 or 4 times what we could get if we used gas to make electricity. And there is talk now of, why don't we use hydrogen to make steel, and then there would be less emissions. Well, you have to make hydrogen from either methane, which produces carbon dioxide, or using electricity, which is much more expensive. So you have to make the hydrogen, which wastes a lot of energy in the first place, and is extremely expensive. And if you then made steel with that, it would be eye-wateringly expensive. So those who say there are ways to lead the world in carbon capture, hydrogen, or something like that, are in effect jumping out of an aeroplane and hoping to invent a cheap parachute on the way down. That is not the way to run an industrial economy.
And Daniel, if we could just go back to the actual mechanics of this nationalisation itself, the bill that's enabling it, it's not strictly a nationalisation where the government is just buying the company at market price. There seems to be an element of coercion where directors of the company, if they disobey the Secretary of State, they face 2 years imprisonment. Do you think that's the right way to go about this?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, that's even worse than outright nationalisation, because you're creating this control without ownership. So the government is getting power without responsibility, in Stanley Baldwin's phrase, right? And it's an extremely dangerous precedent, because around the world, the modern left has worked out that you don't need to own things to tell them what to do, and it's never a good recipe. But I come back to the point that Matt was making, which I just think is the overwhelmingly powerful one here. You can have a green economy or you can have a productive economy, but there's a trade-off, and we can't just keep pretending that you can have it both ways. The idea that you are going to create all these green jobs is a lie. And it's a lie because the people making that claim know it to be untrue. I mean, the government could employ a load of people, right? But that's not creating jobs. That's taking more money out of the productive economy and using it less efficiency. You could create jobs if you banned diggers and closed down JCB and had lines of men with shovels. But I hope everyone could see that would make us poorer. And it's exactly the same when we dictate more expensive energy, less efficient use of resources. Look, there's a separate argument about whether we need to do that, right? It's beyond the scope of this podcast to get into climate change and all that. But if you think that it is necessary, at least have the honesty to say, this is going to be painful and expensive, and this is how much worse off we're all going to be to do it. Don't pretend that somehow you can make money doing things more expensively, right? Read some of the great 19th century French economist Frédéric Bastiat on the subject of the seen and the unseen. It is always and everywhere more expensive to do that. The steel nationalisation is no exception.
Just to interject there, while Dan was one of two people arguing against this nationalisation in the House of Lords, some years ago, I was one of only two peers in the House of Lords arguing against the 2050 net zero target in the debate then. And the thing I said then is, where is the analysis of the cost of this? It's not in the order paper. It's not in the Climate Change Committee's report on this. And I said, please, please, please tell us what your estimate of this cost is going to be, because I think, and I gave reasons, this is going to be an extremely expensive thing. For about a year afterwards, when the gas price, well, for a few years afterwards, when the gas price shot up because of the invasion of Ukraine, and wind power looked briefly a little bit cheaper than gas, while still being very expensive itself, some people were saying, I told you so. But we're now back in the world we were in before then, and we're in now, which is where wind power drives up the cost of energy dramatically. And that is true of every other green measure that has been tried to get us towards net zero in 2050. It is an extremely expensive luxury that is going to deindustrialize the British economy. It's already killed large swathes of our chemical and pharmaceutical industries. It's killing off our AI industry before it's even born, because that's a very energy intensive industry too. So it's not just old industries, it's new industries that are going with this policy. So for me, that is the real root of the problem, is our suicidal energy policy.
And just to finish us off, I'd like to ask you both the same question. British Steel has just received a reprieve, but will we still be making steel in 5, 10, 20 years' time? Daniel, you first.
I have no idea. I mean, somebody could be working on a better alternative right now, right? And if I knew who that somebody was, I'd be making a fortune rather than talking to Spectator listeners, right? I mean, who saw smartphones coming before they came in? Who saw cheap flights, right? It may well be that we'll have some, that fusion will work and all of these arguments about energy will be made redundant. I have great belief in the inventiveness of a free people when given their reign. But I would just come back to this point about energy. And I'm gonna shamelessly now quote my favorite writer on the subject, who's a man called Matt Ridley. You can measure civilization in the fall in the energy price. And Matt has this wonderful illustration of that, where he talks about how many hours of work does the average worker need to do to afford 1 minute of reading light. This much when it's fire, this much when it's kerosene, this much when it's electricity, and so on. This is going to be the first time ever that we have deliberately raised that price. I think the only source of fuel that we've ever phased out before has been whale blubber, and that didn't affect the price. This is going to be the first time that we have an industrial policy that is going to rip out all of the infrastructure that's there and replace it with something more expensive. And the idea that we can do that without getting colder and poorer and more wretched is an utter fantasy. And by all means, if you want to do that, I have my dear friend in the House of Lords, Jenny Jones, one of our two Green peers, is quite open about this and says, yeah, we should be poorer. The growth is a bad thing. Okay, come out and have that argument. But don't fall for the Miliband idea that we can somehow do this in a painless way. That is a lie, and people are going to be very angry when they discover the cost of it.
And just quite recently, a rather intelligent report leaked out of the business department of the government, which made a very good point here, which is that if we do succeed in replacing a lot of these technologies with green technologies before the end of their useful lives, then effectively we have wasted those assets. We have stranded those assets, and we've had to invest in their replacements before they were ready to be replaced. And that itself is a deadweight cost on what we're doing. And just to add numbers to what Dan was saying about the cost of light, on the average wage today, it takes you about 1/5 of a second of work to earn enough light to read a book for an hour. In 1800, it cost you about 6 hours of work. That's an incredible change. That's not actually going to go backwards for light, because we've invented the LED, which has dramatically brought down the cost of light because it's so much more efficient. But for all other energy uses, we're not seeing the same sort of improvements. So if we drive up the cost of energy, we will, as Dan says, increase the number of hours he and I have to spend working in order to use that energy, whether it's embedded in a car or a building or whatever. And that means less hours to buy something else, and that means less jobs for someone else in another industry.
Thanks, Daniel. Thanks, Matt.